They mocked the old woman for adopting a black child. Years later, when disaster struck, he became their only hope. Margaret Thornton stood at the entrance of Millbrook Orphanage, her heart pounding with anticipation. 62, she was about to embark on a journey that many thought foolish, even scandalous. But Margaret had never been one to bow to societal pressures or narrow-minded gossip. The year was 1985, and Millbrook was a small, predominantly white town in rural Alabama. Change came slowly here, if at all. Margaret, a widow of 5 years, had spent her life teaching at the local elementary school. She had raised 2 children of her own, now grown with families of their own in distant cities. The empty nest had been bearable at first, but as the years wore on, Margaret found herself longing for the pitter-patter of little feet and the joy of nurturing a young mind once more. Her decision to adopt hadn't come lightly. She'd spent months researching, attending seminars, and preparing her home. When she finally announced her intentions to her bridge club, the reaction had been mixed at best. Most of her friends were politely skeptical, reminding her of her age and the challenges of raising a child alone. But it was Eugenia Whitaker, the self-appointed matriarch of Millbrook's social scene, who had been the most vocal in her disapproval. "Margaret, dear," Eugenia had drawled, her voice dripping with false concern, "have you really thought this through? A woman of your maturity taking on a child? Simply not done." Margaret had smiled tightly, years of Southern etiquette keeping her true feelings in check. "I appreciate your concern, Eugenia, but I've made up my mind. This is what I want to do." It was then that Margaret dropped the bombshell that would set the town's gossip mill ablaze for months to come. "And I've decided to adopt a child of color. There are so many deserving children who need homes, and I believe I can provide a loving one." The silence that followed was deafening. Eugenia's perfectly plucked eyebrows had shot up so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. The other ladies exchanged meaningful glances, their teacups frozen midway to their lips. "Well, I never," Eugenia finally sputtered. "Margaret Thornton, have you lost your mind? This town has a certain way of life. You can't just bring a black child," Margaret finished for her, her voice steady and firm. "And yes, Eugenia, I can. I will." The memory of that afternoon fueled Margaret's resolve as she stepped into the orphanage. The social worker, a kind-faced woman named Gloria, greeted her with a warm smile. "Mrs. Thornton, it's wonderful to see you again. Are you ready to meet Isaiah?" Margaret nodded, throat suddenly tight with emotion. Gloria led her down a hallway decorated with children's artwork, sound of laughter and play echoing from distant rooms. They stopped at a door marked Playroom 3, and Gloria knocked gently before entering. The room was bright and colorful, filled with toys and books. In the corner, a small boy sat alone, carefully stacking blocks into a teetering tower. He looked up as they entered, his deep brown eyes curious and a little wary. "Isaiah," Gloria called softly, "there's someone here to meet you." The boy stood, his movements careful and deliberate. He was small for his age, Margaret noted, with a lean frame that spoke of too many missed meals. But there was an intelligence in his eyes that took her breath away. "Hello, Isaiah," Margaret said, kneeling down to his level despite the protest of her aging knees. "My name is Margaret. I've been looking forward to meeting you." Isaiah regarded her solemnly for a moment before offering a shy smile. "Hi," he said softly. "Do you want to see my tower?" Margaret's heart melted. "I'd love to," she replied, following him to the corner. As Isaiah explained the intricacies of his architectural marvel, Margaret felt a certainty settle over her. This was her son. She knew it as surely as she'd known anything in her life. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles both expected and unforeseen, but in that moment, none of it mattered. She was already imagining bedtime stories, trips to the park, and the joy of watching this precious child grow and thrive. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of paperwork, home visits, and preparations. Margaret threw herself into getting everything ready, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed her around town. She painted the spare bedroom a cheerful yellow, filled bookshelves with classics from her teaching days, and bought clothes in sizes she could only guess at. Finally, the day arrived. Margaret stood once again at the entrance of Millbrook Orphanage. this time with Gloria by her side and a very nervous Isaiah clutching her hand. "Are you ready to go home, sweetheart?" Margaret asked gently. Isaiah nodded, his eyes wide as he took in the bustling street and the unfamiliar car parked at the curb. As they drove through town, Margaret pointed out landmarks, trying to make the transition as smooth as possible for the overwhelmed child. "And that's the school where I used to teach," she said, gesturing to a red brick building. "You'll be going there in the fall. I think you'll like it." Isaiah remained quiet, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Margaret's heart ached for him, knowing how much change he was experiencing all at once. She vowed to be patient, give him all the time and space he needed to adjust. As they turned onto Maple Street, where Margaret's modest two-story home stood, she noticed a cluster of her neighbors gathered on nearby porches. Word had clearly spread about her impending arrival with her new son. Some faces were curious, others disapproving. Margaret lifted her chin and smiled warmly at Isaiah. "We're home, sweetheart," she announced, pulling into the driveway. As she helped Isaiah out of the car, she heard the distinct voice of Eugenia Whitaker carrying across the quiet street. "Well, would you look at that? She actually went and did it. Lord have mercy on that poor child's soul." Margaret felt a flash of anger, quickly replaced by determination. She knelt down in front of Isaiah, looking him straight in the eye. "Isaiah, I want you to know something very important," she said, her voice clear and strong enough to carry to the onlookers. "You are my son now. This is your home, and you are loved. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." Isaiah's eyes widened, and for the first time since leaving the orphanage, he smiled. A real, bright smile that lit up his whole face. "Okay, Mom," he said, testing out the word. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she pulled him into a gentle hug. As they walked hand in hand into their home, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The first few weeks were a period of adjustment for both Margaret and Isaiah. The boy was quiet and reserved, often spending hours alone in his room with his books or toys. Margaret gave him space but made sure he knew she was always available if he needed anything. Slowly, Isaiah began to open up. Would join Margaret in the kitchen while she cooked, asking questions about the ingredients or offering to help set the table. During their nightly reading sessions, he started to share his thoughts on the stories, revealing a keen mind and a vivid imagination. One evening, as Margaret tucked Isaiah into bed, he asked a question that had clearly been weighing on his mind. "Mom," he said hesitantly, "why do some people look at us funny when we go to the store?" Margaret's heart clenched. She had hoped to shield Isaiah from the prejudice they faced. She knew it was inevitable that he would notice eventually. "Well, sweetheart," he began, choosing her words carefully, "some people aren't used to seeing families that look like ours. They don't understand that love is what makes a family, not the color of our skin." Isaiah furrowed his brow, processing this information. "But that's silly," he said finally. "You're my mom, and I love you. Why does it matter what we look like?" Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride and love for her perceptive son. "You're absolutely right, Isaiah. It doesn't matter at all. And I love you too, more than you can possibly imagine." As the weeks turned into months, Margaret and Isaiah settled into a comfortable routine. They spent weekends exploring the town, visiting the library, and having picnics in the park. Margaret enrolled Isaiah in swim lessons at the community pool, beaming with pride as he overcame his initial fear of the water and learned to paddle confidently across the shallow end. Not everyone in Millbrook was welcoming, of course. There were still whispers and stares, and occasionally more overt displays of prejudice. The incident at the 4th of July parade was particularly upsetting. Margaret and Isaiah had been enjoying the festivities, waving small American flags and cheering as the floats passed by. Suddenly, a group of teenagers on a pickup truck float began shouting racial slurs as they passed. Isaiah's face crumpled and he buried his head against Margaret's side. Before Margaret could react, she heard a booming voice from behind her. "That's enough of that nonsense." She turned to see Harold Jenkins, the town's aging sheriff, striding towards the float, pulled the truck over, and gave the teenagers a stern talking to that had them slouching in shame by the end. Returning to Margaret and Isaiah, Sheriff Jenkins tipped his hat. Mrs. Thornton, Isaiah, I hope the rest of your holiday is more pleasant. Please don't let a few ignorant troublemakers spoil your day. Margaret was touched by the unexpected support. Thank you, Sheriff, she said warmly. That means a lot. As they walked home that evening, Isaiah's small hand clasped tightly in hers. Margaret reflected on the challenges they had faced and overcome in their short time together. She knew there would be more obstacles ahead. She was more certain than ever that she had made the right decision in adopting Isaiah. Little did she know that this bright, resilient boy would one day grow into a man who would change not just their lives, but the entire town of Millbrook, in ways no one could have imagined. As the years passed, Isaiah grew from a shy, reserved child into a curious and determined teenager. Margaret watched with pride as he excelled in school, natural intelligence blossoming under her encouragement and the guidance of his teachers. By the time he entered high school, Isaiah was at the top of his class, with a particular aptitude for science and mathematics that left even his most experienced teachers in awe. However, academic success didn't shield Isaiah from the harsh realities growing up as one of the few black children in Millbrook. The whispers and stares that had followed Margaret when she first adopted him had evolved into more overt forms of discrimination as Isaiah grew older and more visible in the community. One crisp autumn afternoon when Isaiah was 15, Margaret received a call from the high school principal, Mr. Clarence Dutton. Her heart sank as she heard the strain in his voice. Mrs. Thornton, there's been an incident involving Isaiah. I think you should come down to the school right away. Margaret rushed to Millbrook High, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, she found Isaiah sitting outside the principal's office, his usually neat school uniform disheveled and a dark bruise forming under his left eye. Oh, Isaiah, Margaret gasped, kneeling in front of him despite her arthritic knees. What happened, sweetheart? Before Isaiah could answer, office door opened. Mr. Dutton ushered them inside. Seated in the office were two other boys, both sporting their own set of bruises, and their parents, including, to Margaret's dismay, Eugenia Whitaker and her husband George. Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Dutton began, his voice weary. I'm afraid there was a fight in the schoolyard. From what we've gathered, racial slurs were exchanged, and then, well, fists started flying. Eugenia Whitaker sniffed disdainfully. I hardly think exchanged is the right word, Clarence. It's clear that this boy attacked my Tommy without provocation. Margaret felt her temper flare, but before she could respond, Isaiah spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. That's not true, Mrs. Whitaker. Tommy and Steve cornered me after class. They've been harassing me for weeks, calling me names, leaving notes in my locker. Today, they said I didn't belong here, that I should go back to where I came from. Isaiah's voice broke slightly, but he continued. I told them that this is my home, that my mother and I belong here as much as anyone. That's when Tommy pushed me, and Steve tried to grab my backpack. I defended myself, that's all. The room fell silent as Isaiah finished speaking. Margaret's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride at her son's eloquence and courage, and sorrow that he had to endure such treatment. Mr. Dutton cleared his throat. Given the circumstances, and Isaiah's spotless record up until now, I'm inclined to view this as self-defense. However, fighting of any kind is against school policy. I'm suspending all 3 boys for 3 days, after which we'll have a meeting to discuss how we can prevent such incidents in the future. As they left the office, Margaret overheard Eugenia muttering to her husband, I told you no good would come of Margaret adopting that boy. He's bringing nothing but trouble to this town. Margaret straightened her spine and looked Eugenia directly in the eye. My son is not the trouble here, Eugenia. The trouble is the prejudice and small-mindedness that some people in this town cling to. Isaiah is a kind, intelligent young man who deserves respect, not harassment. Perhaps if you spent more time teaching your son about compassion and less time gossiping, we wouldn't be in this situation. With that, Margaret put her arm around Isaiah's shoulders and guided him out of the school, leaving a sputtering Eugenia in their wake. That evening, as Margaret applied a cold compress to Isaiah's bruised eye, they had a long talk about the incident and its implications. I'm sorry, Mom, Isaiah said softly. I know you always taught me that violence isn't the answer, But I just couldn't stand there and let them say those things. Margaret sighed, gently stroking Isaiah's cheek. Oh, sweetheart, you have nothing to apologize for. I'm sorry that you had to face such cruelty. You handled yourself with dignity and courage, and I couldn't be prouder of you. Isaiah's eyes welled with tears. Sometimes I wonder if it would be easier if I lived somewhere else. Somewhere with more people who look like me. Maybe you'd have an easier life too, without all the gossip and judgment. Margaret felt her heart break a little at his words. She took Isaiah's hands in hers, looking him straight in the eye. Isaiah Thornton, listen to me. You are my son, and this is your home. We belong here, and we're not going to let anyone drive us out. People who matter accept us and love us for who we are. As for the rest, well, their small-mindedness is their problem, not ours. She paused, considering her next words carefully. But I want you to remember something important. The people who are cruel to you, who say hurtful things, they're often acting out of fear or ignorance. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but understanding that might help you respond with compassion rather than anger. You have the power to change minds, Isaiah, through your actions and your achievements. Don't let them dim your light. Isaiah nodded slowly, absorbing her words. I'll try, Mom. Promise. The suspension turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Margaret took the opportunity to introduce Isaiah to Dr. James Carter, an old friend from her college days who had gone on to become a renowned physicist. Dr. Carter, who was visiting Millbrook for a conference, was immediately impressed by Isaiah's intelligence and curiosity. Over the course of long discussions that spanned topics from quantum mechanics to the ethics of scientific research, Dr. Carter became a mentor and role model for Isaiah. He showed the young man that there was a whole world of possibilities beyond the narrow confines of Millbrook, a world where his mind and his potential mattered far more than the color of his skin. When Isaiah returned to school, he did so with a new sense of purpose. He threw himself into his studies with even greater dedication, particularly in the sciences. He joined the debate team, using his natural eloquence to argue passionately for social justice and equality. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change. Isaiah's academic achievements couldn't be ignored, even by those who had previously dismissed him. When he led the school's science team to victory in the state championships, his picture was featured on the front page of the Millbrook Gazette. The article praised his brilliance and leadership, making no mention of his race. A small but significant step forward. More importantly, Isaiah's classmates began to see him in a new light. His kindness, intelligence, and quiet strength won over even some of his former tormentors. Tommy Whitaker, to everyone's surprise, approached Isaiah one day after class to apologize for his past behavior. It was an awkward, halting apology, but it was sincere, and it marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship that would have far-reaching consequences in the years to come. As Isaiah's high school graduation approached, Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey they had taken together. There had been struggles and tears, moments of doubt and fear, but there had also been joy, love, and triumph. Isaiah, the night before the graduation ceremony, as they sat on the porch swing enjoying the warm spring evening, Isaiah turned to Margaret with a serious expression. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you've done for me. You took a chance on me when no one else would, and you've stood by me through everything. I wouldn't be who I am today without you." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Oh, Isaiah," he said, pulling him into a tight hug, "you've given me far more than I could ever give you. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. I thank God every day for bringing you into my life." As they embraced, Margaret caught sight of a shooting star streaking across the night sky. She closed her eyes and made a silent wish, not for herself, for Isaiah. She wished for a world that would see him for the remarkable person he was, a world where he could achieve his full potential without the barriers of prejudice and discrimination. Little did Margaret know that her wish was about to come true in ways she could never have imagined. Isaiah's journey was just beginning, and the impact he would have on Millbrook and beyond would surpass even her wildest dreams. The years following Isaiah's high school graduation were a whirlwind of achievement and growth. With Margaret's unwavering support and the guidance of mentors like Dr. Carter, Isaiah pursued his passion for science with single-minded determination. He was accepted into MIT on a full scholarship, where he quickly distinguished himself as one of the brightest minds of his generation. Margaret, now in her mid-70s, found herself navigating a bittersweet mix of emotions. She was immensely proud of Isaiah's accomplishments, but his absence left a palpable void in her life. They spoke on the phone regularly, and Isaiah made sure to visit during holidays and breaks. But Millbrook felt emptier without his presence. During one of Isaiah's visits home, as they sat in the kitchen sharing a pot of Margaret's famous peach cobbler, Isaiah broached a subject that had been on his mind for some time. "Mom," he began, a hint of nervousness in his voice, "I've been thinking a lot about my research focus, and I believe I've found something that could make a real difference." Margaret leaned forward, intrigued. "Tell me more, sweetheart." Isaiah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm as he explained. "I want to develop sustainable energy solutions for underserved communities. I've been studying the environmental and economic impacts of fossil fuel dependence, especially in rural areas like Millbrook. I think there's potential to create affordable, renewable energy systems that could transform these communities." Margaret felt a surge of pride. Even as Isaiah's world had expanded far beyond the borders of their small town, he hadn't forgotten his roots. "That sounds wonderful, Isaiah, but I imagine it won't be easy. What are the challenges you're facing?" Isaiah sighed, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. "Funding is the biggest hurdle. This kind of research requires significant resources, and it's not always seen as profitable in the short term. But I'm determined to find a way. I truly believe this could change lives." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "If anyone can do it, you can. And remember, you've got a whole town of people here who believe in you." Isaiah raised an eyebrow skeptically. "I'm not so sure about that, Mom. I don't think Millbrook has changed as much as you might hope." Margaret shook her head firmly. "You'd be surprised, Isaiah. Your success has opened a lot of eyes around here. People are proud to say they know you, even some who weren't so welcoming before. Change comes slowly. It does come." As if to prove Margaret's point, their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. To their surprise, it was Mayor Frank Thompson, a man who had once been one of Eugenia Whitaker's staunchest allies in opposing Isaiah's adoption. "Mrs. Thornton, Isaiah," Mayor greeted them, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I heard Isaiah was in town and, well, I was hoping to have a word." Margaret invited him in, curious about the purpose of his visit. Mayor Thompson settled into a chair, clearly uncomfortable, but determined. "Isaiah," he began, "I'll get right to the point. Millbrook is facing some tough times. Our main factory shut down last year and we're struggling to attract new businesses. Unemployment is rising and young people are leaving in droves. We need help. Well, we were hoping you might have some ideas." Isaiah listened intently, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Actually, Mayor Thompson, I've been working on something that might be relevant to Millbrook's situation. It's a project focused on sustainable energy solutions for rural communities." For the next hour, Isaiah outlined his research, explaining how implementing renewable energy systems could not only reduce costs for residents, but also attract eco-friendly businesses to the area. Mayor Thompson listened with growing excitement. "This could be exactly what Millbrook needs," he said when Isaiah finished. "But I have to ask, why would you want to help us? God knows this town hasn't always treated you fairly." Isaiah glanced at Margaret, drawing strength from her proud smile. "Millbrook is my home," said simply. "It's where I grew up, where I learned the values that guide me today. Yes, there were challenges. There was also kindness and community. I want to give back, to show that diversity and progress can go hand in hand with small-town values." Mayor Thompson nodded slowly, a look of respect settling on his features. "Well, son, if you're willing to help us, we'd be fools not to accept. What do you need from us to get started?" And so began a new chapter in Isaiah's life and in the history of Millbrook. Over the next few years, Isaiah split his time between his research at MIT and his work in his hometown. With the support of the town council and a group of forward-thinking residents, he began implementing his renewable energy solutions. The project started small, with solar panels installed on the roofs of public buildings and a wind farm established on the outskirts of town. But as energy costs dropped and word of Millbrook's innovation spread, things began to change rapidly. New businesses, attracted by the promise of low energy costs and positive PR, began to set up shop in Millbrook. The town's young people, inspired by Isaiah's example, started returning home, bringing with them fresh ideas and renewed vitality. Millbrook was transforming before everyone's eyes, becoming a model for sustainable rural development. Not everyone was thrilled with the changes, of course. Eugenia Whitaker and a small group of traditionalists grumbled about the town losing its character. But even they couldn't deny the economic benefits of Isaiah's project. One summer evening, as Margaret and Isaiah sat on their porch watching the sunset, a familiar figure approached their house. It was Tommy Whitaker, Eugenia's son and Isaiah's former tormentor turned unlikely friend. "Isaiah," Tommy called out, a grin spreading across his face, "I've got news. Remember that eco-friendly manufacturing company you put me in touch with? They've offered me a job as their local liaison. Can you believe it? Me, working for a green energy company." Isaiah laughed, genuinely pleased for his friend. "That's fantastic, Tommy. I told you your business degree would come in handy." As Tommy chatted excitedly about his new opportunity, Margaret marveled at the changes she'd witnessed. The boy who had once bullied her son was now one of his strongest supporters, eagerly embracing the new direction Isaiah was helping to chart for their town. Later that night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. She thought of the day she'd first met Isaiah at the orphanage, of the challenges they'd faced together, and of the remarkable man he'd become. A wave of emotion washed over her as she realized that in trying to provide a home for a lonely little boy, she'd set in motion a chain of events, was now transforming an entire community. Isaiah hadn't just grown into a successful individual, he'd become a catalyst for change, a beacon of hope for Millbrook and beyond. As she drifted off to sleep, Margaret sent up a silent prayer of gratitude, the blessing that was her son. She couldn't wait to see what the future held for Isaiah and for Millbrook. Little did Margaret know, the greatest challenge and the greatest triumph of Isaiah's life was yet to come. The seeds of change he'd planted in Millbrook were about to bear fruit in ways that would test his resolve, challenge his principles, and ultimately redefine the very fabric of community. As Millbrook flourished under the influence of Isaiah's renewable energy initiatives, few could have predicted the crisis that was about to strike. It began with unseasonal storms, a series of increasingly severe weather events that meteorologists struggled to explain. Flash floods, violent winds, and even a small tornado ripped through the region, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. At first, the town rallied together, with neighbors helping neighbors to clean up and rebuild. But as the storms continued, week after week, a sense of desperation began to set in. Crops were ruined, businesses suffered, and the newfound prosperity of Millbrook seemed to be slipping away. It was during this time of crisis that Isaiah's work took on a new level of importance. The renewable energy systems he had implemented proved more resilient than traditional infrastructure, providing power to essential services even when conventional systems failed. The wind farm and solar arrays, once seen by some as eyesores, now stood as beacons of hope in the storm-ravaged landscape. One particularly harrowing night, as rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the streets, Margaret sat in her living room, clutching a battery-powered radio. The weatherman's voice crackled through the speaker, warning of an approaching supercell storm, potentially the most devastating yet. Just then, there was a pounding at the door. Margaret opened it to find Mayor Thompson, his face etched with worry. "Mrs. Thornton," he gasped, out of breath, "we need Isaiah. The storms damaged the levee upriver. If it breaks, half the town could be underwater by morning. We've tried evacuating, but the roads are flooded. We're trapped." Margaret's heart raced. "Isaiah's at the research center," she said, already reaching for her coat. "We need to get to him." Despite Margaret's protests, Mayor Thompson insisted on driving her through the treacherous conditions to the research center Isaiah had established on the outskirts of town. As they navigated the flooded streets, Margaret couldn't help but remember the naysayers who had once laughed at her decision to adopt Isaiah. Now, in their darkest hour, he was the one they turned to for salvation. They found Isaiah at the center, surrounded by a team of researchers and engineers, all working feverishly at computer terminals and complex machinery. "Mom," Isaiah exclaimed, rushing to embrace Margaret, "you shouldn't be out in this weather. It's not safe." "Isaiah," Mayor Thompson interrupted, "we need your help." "The levee." "I know." Isaiah cut him off, his voice grave. "We've been monitoring the situation, but I think we might have a solution." Over the next few minutes, Isaiah outlined a daring plan. Using the advanced energy storage systems they'd been developing, combined with a network of high-powered pumps, they believed they could relieve the pressure on the levee and redirect the floodwaters away from the town. "It's risky," Isaiah admitted. "We've never tested the system at this scale, and someone will need to manually activate the pumps at the river station. In these conditions, it's a dangerous job." Before anyone else could speak, Margaret stepped forward. "I'll do it," she said firmly. Isaiah's eyes widened in shock. "Mom, no, it's too dangerous. I'll go myself." Margaret shook her head, a familiar determination in her eyes. "Isaiah, listen to me. You're needed here, coordinating everything. I may be old, but I'm not helpless. I taught in this town for 40 years. I know every inch of that river. Let me do this for our home." There was a moment of tense silence as mother and son locked eyes, a lifetime of love and trust passing between them. Finally, Isaiah nodded, pulling Margaret into a tight embrace. "Okay," he whispered, "but you be careful. Can't lose you, Mom." As Margaret set out with a team of volunteers, Isaiah turned his attention to coordinating the massive undertaking. Every available resource was mobilized, from the town's emergency services to ordinary citizens who braved the storm to lend a hand. Hours passed in a blur of activity. Isaiah's voice, calm and authoritative, guided the efforts via radio and smartphone. He directed the strategic placement of pumps, monitored energy levels, and made split-second decisions that could mean the difference between salvation and disaster. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to subside. Exhausted but hopeful, the people of Millbrook gathered at the edge of town, watching anxiously as the swollen river churned against the straining levee. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed as though their efforts might have been in vain. The water rose higher, lapping at the very top of the barrier. But then, slowly but surely, the level began to drop. Isaiah's plan had worked. Town was saved. Cheer went up from the crowd, cathartic release of fear and tension. Isaiah, however, had eyes only for one person. As soon as he spotted Margaret's bedraggled figure among the returning volunteers, he rushed to her, enveloping her in a bone-crushing hug. "You did it, Mom," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us all." Margaret pulled back, her eyes shining with pride and love. "No, Isaiah, we did it, all of us together." In the days and weeks that followed, as Millbrook began the long process of recovery, a profound change came over the town. The crisis had united the community in a way that nothing else could have. Old prejudices and divisions seemed to melt away in the face of their shared triumph over adversity. Isaiah's renewable energy systems, which had proven so crucial during the crisis, were now embraced wholeheartedly. The town became a model of resilience and sustainability, attracting attention and investment from across the country. One sunny afternoon, about a month after the storm, Margaret and Isaiah sat on their porch watching as a group of children played in the street. Among them were kids of all races, the children and grandchildren of longtime Millbrook residents, playing alongside those of new families, drawn by the town's growing reputation as a forward-thinking community. "You know," Margaret mused, a contented smile on her face, "I remember the day I told the Bridge Club I was adopting you. Eugenia Whitaker said I was making a mistake, that it would never work out." Isaiah chuckled, shaking his head. I wonder what she'd say now. As if on cue, they spotted Eugenia herself walking up the street, leaning on a cane but still as regal as ever. To their surprise, she paused at their gate. "Margaret, Isaiah," she called out, her voice quavering slightly with age. "I wonder if I might have a word?" They invited her onto the porch, curiosity piqued. Eugenia settled into a chair, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began, "about the past, about the things I said and did, and I've come to realize that I was wrong. About a lot of things, but especially about you two." She turned to Isaiah, her eyes misty. "Young man, you've done more for this town than anyone in its history. You've made us better, all of us. And Margaret," she continued, reaching out to clasp Margaret's hand, "you saw what the rest of us couldn't. You had the courage to follow your heart, and we're all better for it." Margaret felt tears welling in her eyes as Eugenia spoke the words she never thought she'd hear. "Thank you, Eugenia," she said softly. "That means a lot." As Eugenia took her leave, Margaret and Isaiah sat in companionable silence, watching the sun begin to set over their beloved town. So much had changed since that day, over 30 years ago, when Margaret had first brought Isaiah home. The journey hadn't been easy, but every hardship, every struggle had led them to this moment. "You know, Mom," Isaiah said, breaking the silence, "I've been offered a position at MIT. Full professorship, my own research team, unlimited funding." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Oh, Isaiah, that's wonderful. When do you leave?" Isaiah smiled, shaking his head. "I turned it down. My work is here, Mom, in Millbrook. This town gave me a home when I had none, gave me a mother who loved me unconditionally. Now it's my turn to give back. We're going to make Millbrook a beacon of hope, a model for what a community can achieve when it comes together." Margaret felt her heart swell with an overwhelming mix of love, pride, and gratitude. She thought of the lonely little boy she'd met all those years ago and marveled at the extraordinary man he'd become. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Margaret realized that their story was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. The laughter that had once been directed at them in scorn had transformed into the joyful sound of community reborn. And at the heart of it all was the unbreakable bond between a mother and the son she had chosen. A love that had the power to change not just their lives, the world around them. In that moment, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice all those years ago. By opening her heart to a child in need, she had set in motion a chain of events that would ripple out far beyond the borders of their small town. And as she sat there, hand in hand with her son, she felt a profound sense of peace and purpose. The future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. And whatever challenges it might bring, Margaret knew that they would face them together, just as they always had. For in the end, it was love. The love of a mother for her son and the love of a community for its own that had the power to overcome all obstacles and light the way forward.